All right, let's talk about the year 1857. It was an absolute flashpoint in Indian history. For almost 100 years, the British East India Company had been tightening its grip on India. But in 1857, something just snapped. A pot of resentment that had been simmering for decades finally boiled over, sparking a conflict that would shake the British Empire to its core and totally redefine India's future.
So, that's the big question, right? How on earth could a single rumor, a whisper about animal fat on a bullet, ignite a rebellion that spread across an entire empire? Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack here. And believe me, the answer is way more complicated than just a piece of ammunition. And you know, right from the get-go, you can see there are two completely different sides to this story. For the British, this was the Sepoy Mutiny, just a little problem with their soldiers, an act of insubordination. But for Indians, it was something much, much bigger. The First War of Independence, a unified fight for freedom. The names alone tell you everything you need to know about the deep, deep divide we're about to explore.
So, what was the actual trigger? The thing that finally set it all off? Well, it all boils down to a new piece of military gear that was brought in back in 1856. A weapon that was meant to be more efficient. But ironically, it became the very spark that lit the whole fuse. Okay, so here's the deal with this new Enfield rifle. To load it, a soldier, or a sepoy as they were called, had to literally bite off the end of a paper cartridge before putting it in the gun. Now, here's the problem. A rumor started spreading that the grease used on those cartridges was made from cow and pig fat. For Hindu soldiers, cows are sacred. For Muslim soldiers, pigs are unclean. So being forced to put that in your mouth, this wasn't just a military order. It was seen as a direct attack on their faith. A massive, massive deal.
And this brings us to one man, Mangal Pandey. On March 29th, he had enough. He refused the cartridges and actually attacked his British officers. His act of defiance, man, it made him the rebellion's first martyr. And even though he was caught and executed pretty quickly, what he did sent absolute shockwaves through the army. The spark had officially been lit.
But here's the thing about a spark. It can't do anything without a tinderbox ready to catch fire. That cartridge rumor? It was just the final insult after nearly a century of problems. Let's dig into the long-simmering issues that made the ground so fertile for a massive explosion.
First, let's look inside the army itself. The resentment was just off the charts. Indian soldiers were paid way less than their British counterparts for doing the exact same job. And promotions? Forget about it. No matter how good you were, you could never get a rank higher than Subedar. On top of that, new laws forced them to serve overseas, which many believed would make them lose their caste. And after seeing the British get beaten in the first Afghan war, that whole myth of them being invincible, yeah, that was shattered. And outside the military barracks, British policies were making people really anxious. You had social reforms, like banning the practice of sati and legalizing widow remarriage. Now, while some saw these as progressive, many Orthodox Indians saw them as a direct attack on their most sacred traditions. You had Christian missionaries trying to convert people, new taxes on temples and mosques. Even the brand new railways were seen as a threat, because suddenly a high-caste Brahmin had to sit right next to someone from a lower caste. It all felt like a plan to destroy their culture.
Now, it's so important to get this. This wasn't just a popular uprising. The ruling class, the princes and kings, they were just as furious. The British had these aggressive policies where they were just swallowing up Indian kingdoms left and right. These so-called alliances basically turned Indian rulers into puppets. And maybe the biggest insult of all was the way they were systematically disrespecting and dismantling the authority of the Mughal emperor, who was still the symbolic head of India.
The doctrine of lapse especially created a ton of fear. This policy was a real game changer and not in a good way. Basically, the British said if a ruler died without a direct natural male heir, their kingdom was just absorbed into British India. Tough luck. Adopted sons didn't count. This is how states like Jhansi and Nagpur were taken over, turning the rulers into bitter enemies of the British.
And underneath all of this was just crushing economic pain. India's resources were being drained to fuel Britain's industrial revolution. Cheap, machine-made goods from Britain flooded the market, destroying the livelihoods of local Indian craftspeople. Peasants were getting slammed with incredibly high taxes, and a single commission took away over 20,000 estates, basically dispossessing a huge chunk of the aristocracy overnight. It didn't matter if you were a prince or a peasant, you were feeling the squeeze.
So, the tinderbox is full to the brim. The spark from Mangal Pandey's protest is lit, and boom! What started as a mutiny in one little town exploded into a full-blown wildfire of rebellion, spreading all across northern and central India.
And just look at how fast this all happened. After Mango Pandey was executed in April, things just escalated. In May, soldiers in a town called Meerut refused the cartridges. They were thrown in jail, but then their friends broke them out. They killed their British officers, and then they did something incredibly symbolic. They marched to Delhi, the old capital of the Mughal Empire.
Once they got to Delhi, they proclaimed the old Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, as their leader. And that was a huge turning point. This wasn't just a military mutiny anymore. It was a political rebellion. And soon other leaders rose up all over the country. You had Begum Hazrat Mahal in Lucknow, Nana Sahib in Kanpur, and of course, the legendary Rani Lakshmi Bai of Jhansi, whose kingdom had been taken by that doctrine of lapse we talked about.
The rebellion was fierce, no doubt about it, but the British response was equally, if not more, brutal. After the initial shock wore off, the empire gathered its massive resources to crush the uprising, and the consequences of that suppression would fundamentally change India for the next 90 years.
The most immediate change was political. The British government basically blamed the East India Company for messing things up so badly. So, with the Government of India Act of 1858, they completely abolished the company's rule. From that point on, India was to be governed directly by the British Crown. This was the official beginning of the British Raj.
The British also had a terrifying realization. They could never again trust their Indian army in the same way. So, they came up with a new policy of division and counterpoise. The goal was simple: do everything possible to make sure Indian soldiers could never again unite to challenge British rule.
And the numbers tell the whole story. First, they slashed the number of Indian soldiers in the army, a huge drop of nearly 100,000 troops, a really clear sign of their distrust.
And on the flip side, they significantly boosted the number of European troops to really cement their control. Critical jobs, like handling the artillery, were now pretty much reserved just for them.
And other sweeping changes followed right after. That hated doctrine of lapse? Gone. They abolished it to try and calm down the remaining Indian princes. The Mughal dynasty, which had been such a powerful symbol for the rebels, was officially ended. And, most fatefully, the British doubled down on their policy of divide and rule, deliberately stirring up tensions between Hindus and Muslims to make sure a unified opposition could never form again.
So, the rebellion was crushed. The old way of doing things was gone. But what was the long-term legacy of 1857? How did this failed uprising end up shaping the future of both the British Raj and the new Indian nation that was just beginning to emerge?
Well, here's the thing. Even though it was a military failure, 1857 was a huge psychological turning point. The heroes of the rebellion, people like Mango Pandey, Rani Lakshmi Bai, and Tantia Tope, became legends. For the very first time, people from different regions, different religions, and different classes had all fought together against a common enemy. It became this powerful symbol of a united struggle.
This quote just sums it up perfectly. Even in defeat, the sacrifices made in 1857 planted what's been called the seed of nationalism. The fight for freedom would continue, but now it had a founding story, an inspiration for the very long road that lay ahead.
Which brings us to our final question, and it's a big one. On the surface, yeah, the rebellion was a catastrophic failure. But when you look at the long arc of history, did it really fail? Or was the brutal crushing of the 1857 rebellion the very thing that lit a fire that could never be put out? A fire that set India on its inevitable path to independence? It's a pretty powerful thought to end on. Let's dive into how modern India was forged through an incredible mix of struggle, strategy, and sacrifice. So that's the big question, right? How did this actually happen? Because it wasn't just one battle or one leader. It was a long, winding road with so many twists and turns. We're going to break down exactly how it all went down, starting with the very first spark that lit the whole thing on fire.
All right, let's jump in. We have to go back to the middle of the 19th century. There was this event. The British called it the Sepoy Mutiny, but for many Indians, it was the first war of independence. Whatever you call it, this was the moment that changed the game completely.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The immediate trigger seems almost small, but it was a massive cultural bombshell. See, to load these new rifles, soldiers had to bite the cartridge open. Think about it. For Hindu soldiers, the cow is sacred. For Muslim soldiers, the pig is forbidden. So being forced to put this fat in your mouth, it was seen as a direct, deliberate attack on their most deeply held beliefs. It was personal.
But here's the thing. Those cartridges? They were just the matchstick. The whole country was like a powder keg that had been filling up for decades.
In the military, Indian soldiers were treated like second-class citizens. Politically, the British were just absorbing Indian kingdoms left and right with policies like the doctrine of lapse. Socially, it felt like their entire way of life was under attack. And economically, British policies were crushing local industries and taxing farmers into poverty. It was a perfect storm of anger.
Now, the revolt was eventually put down, but wow, did it force some massive change. This is the key takeaway. The East India Company, this private corporation that had been running India for 100 years, was gone, just like that. The British government stepped in and took direct control. This is the official start of the British Raj. It was a complete and total reset of how India was ruled.
Okay, so the armed rebellion of 1857 didn't succeed, but its failure taught everyone a huge lesson. They realized that scattered fights weren't going to work. The only way forward was to get organized, to unify. And that realization gave rise to a powerful new idea. And that big idea? It was nationalism. The concept that, hey, despite all our different languages, religions, and castes, we have something in common. We are one people, one Indian nation, united against a foreign ruler. For a place as incredibly diverse as the Indian subcontinent, this was a genuinely revolutionary way to think.
An idea is great, but it needs a platform, right? A voice. So, after a few early groups got the ball rolling, the Indian National Congress was formed in 1885. And get this, it was actually co-founded by a retired British official. It started out pretty small, just 72 people at the first meeting. And their initial goals were, well, pretty modest. They weren't demanding independence, just a bigger say in how things were run.
But as you can imagine, once you get a movement like this going, people start to have different ideas about the best way forward. A big debate started inside the Congress itself about strategy, and two very different schools of thought began to emerge.
And this slide lays out the split perfectly. On one side, you had the moderates. They basically believed in playing by British rules. They thought if they were polite, made petitions, and protested peacefully, they could gradually get more rights. Then you had the assertives, or radicals. They had zero faith in British fairness. Their goal wasn't just reform, it was Swaraj, complete self-rule. And their methods were much more direct. Boycotts, strikes, getting the masses involved.
And if you want to know what that new assertive attitude sounded like, just listen to this. Swaraj is my birthright, and I shall have it. That's Bal Gangadhar Tilak, a key assertive leader. You can just feel the shift, right? It's not a polite request anymore. It's a powerful, non-negotiable demand. And then, bam! In 1905, the British did something that basically proved the assertives' point for them. They partitioned Bengal. The official story was that it was just too big to manage, but everyone knew the real reason was a classic divide-and-rule strategy. They wanted to split the heart of Indian nationalism and drive a wedge between Hindus and Muslims.
The reaction was massive and immediate. It kicked off the Swadeshi movement. Swadeshi just means of one's own country. People stopped buying British stuff, cloth, sugar, you name it, and started buying Indian-made goods instead. It was genius, really. It hit the British right in the wallet while building up India's own industries and sense of pride. This was the assertives' playbook in action, and it was working.
The Swadeshi movement was a game changer. It showed everybody the incredible power of getting ordinary people involved, and that set the stage perfectly for the arrival of the man who would take that idea and turn it into a nationwide force, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. When he came back to India in 1915, a whole new chapter began.
Now, Gandhi's central idea was satyagraha, and it's really important we get this right. This wasn't just passive resistance. It was active. It was confrontational. It meant holding on to the truth, or satya, and using that moral power, that truth force, to resist injustice without ever resorting to violence. This philosophy would become the engine of the freedom movement.
And he put this idea into practice with 3 absolutely massive all-India campaigns. Each one turned up the heat. First, in the 1920s, the non-cooperation movement, basically telling people to just stop cooperating with the British system. Then, in 1930, the civil disobedience movement, where they started actively but peacefully breaking unjust laws. And finally, in 1942, the Quit India movement, a straight-up demand for the British to leave. Now.
To give you a sense of the scale we're talking about, just look at this number, 240 miles. That is the insane distance Gandhi and his followers marched to the sea in 1930. And why? To do something incredibly simple, to make their own salt and defy the British salt tax. This one event, the Dandi March, got the world's attention and showed everyone the power of mass nonviolent protest.
By 1942, the tone had changed yet again. The message was now do or die.
This was Gandhi's call to the nation during the Quit India movement. It was a signal that the time for slow, gradual steps was over. This was it. This was the final, all-or-nothing push for freedom.
The Quit India movement, combined with the absolute drain of World War II, really put the British on the back foot. The end of the British Raj was finally, actually in sight. But this final chapter of the story, well, it would be the most heartbreaking.
Because at the same time all of this was happening, another political movement was growing stronger. The Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was arguing that Hindus and Muslims were fundamentally two different nations. By 1940, they made it official. They demanded a separate homeland for Muslims, to be called Pakistan. This completely changed the game for the final negotiation.
So this led to the final British plan for leaving, the Mountbatten Plan, and it laid it all out in black and white. The country would be split into two, India and Pakistan. The huge provinces of Bengal and Punjab would also be cut in half, and it was all going to happen fast, really fast. The date for the transfer of power was set for August 15th, 1947.
Which leads to the huge, agonizing question. Why did the Congress, which had fought for a united India for decades, agree to this? Well, they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. They feared that not agreeing would lead to a massive, uncontrollable civil war. At the end of the day, they made the impossible choice to accept division in order to get immediate freedom and ensure the new India could be stable.
And so on that day, August 15th, 1947, after a 90-year struggle that started with those grease cartridges, the British flag came down for the last time. Two new countries were born. Freedom had been won, but the dream of a united subcontinent was lost in the process.
So, the journey from revolt to republic was complete. But it leaves us with this really profound question. Independence was finally a reality, but the partition created wounds that haven't fully healed, even today. Looking back at this long, complicated, and often painful story, it really makes you think, doesn't it? What does this journey really teach us about the true cost of freedom?